The Economist.
Hello and welcome to The Intelligence from The Economist. I'm Rosie Blore.
And I'm Jason Palmer. Every weekday, we provide a fresh perspective on the events shaping your world.
Our correspondent recently went to a conference for TikTokers to find out why so many people want to be influencers and who's being influenced.
And when I was at university, goth culture was huge. You know, dark clothes, brooding music, monochrome, disaffected youth. Then goth just kind of faded until Gen Z raised it from the dead. First up, though,
This is amazing. Unbelievable.
Everyone is talking about what's going to happen in America's election next week. But there's some predictive power in looking back 8 years ago when votes were being tallied and Democrats got a gut punch.
Some big news here, Megan. Huge news. Actually, the AP now projecting that Donald Trump has won the state of Pennsylvania.
That is the race, frankly. There is no path forward for Hillary Clinton.
Hillary Clinton lost Pennsylvania to Donald Trump by less than a percentage point, the first time the state had voted Republican in 28 years. The so-called blue wall, including Michigan and Wisconsin, was crumbling. 4 years later, Joe Biden squeaked by with a margin of just 80,000 votes. This time around, it's very much up in the air again. In the last of our series on swing states, we're going to take a look at Pennsylvania, because whoever takes it will probably be president.
Out of all the swing states, Pennsylvania has the most electoral college votes at 19.
Adam O'Neill is The Economist's Washington correspondent.
Roughly speaking, whoever wins Pennsylvania, 90% of the time, they go on to win the presidency. And the campaigns are aware of this, which is why in a state with about 13 million people, they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars on radio, TV, and digital ads that are constantly bombarding anyone in the state.
But as we've done with this series from the start, let's talk about what makes Pennsylvania a swing state, why it's so competitive.
Pennsylvania has been sort of at the forefront of the political realignment that we've seen of highly educated voters moving to the Democrats and more working class, especially working class white people voting for Republicans. Donald Trump is highly competitive in Western Pennsylvania, more rural areas. Kamala Harris obviously dominates in the cities, and she's done a lot better in the suburbs where Republicans used to be stronger. And when you add $400 million in campaign ads, it turns into a highly competitive, very closely contested race where they're battling both to turn out their base, but also fighting over a more contested suburban vote.
But what is it that voters actually care about in Pennsylvania? What's the campaigning about?
Voters really care about immigration. A lot of voters are deeply concerned about reproductive rights and abortion. Politicians talk a lot about fracking. Where you are in Pennsylvania determines that. There are a lot of people in cities or in non-energy producing counties who don't particularly care if it's banned or not. But the one thing that affects everybody is the economy, and in particular, inflation and rising prices. And when you're driving around in your car or you're turning on the TV or you're watching a YouTube video, it's not going to be very long until you see an advertisement for a political candidate who somehow promises to lower prices.
We developed the greatest economy in history by far. When I left office, it changed. Inflation destroyed the lives of so many people.
It's the issue that they're constantly hammering.
So to your mind, who's winning on the economy messaging then?
People blame the incumbent administration, the Biden-Harris administration, for their economic woes. And polling backs that up in the sense that people usually say that they think they'll be better off with Trump in the White House. Kamala Harris is in a difficult position because she's the vice president, and it's awkward to undermine the president. And she says she wouldn't do anything differently, but things will change. So she's walking this sort of muddled message. She outlined her vision on the economy at a speech in Pittsburgh.
And we will invest in the industries that, for example, made Pittsburgh the Steel City by offering tax credits for expanding good union jobs in steel and iron and manufacturing communities like here in Mon Valley.
When I ask folks who work on the Harris campaign about this, how do you think your message is landing versus Donald Trump's? They point out that their candidate tends to be a little more disciplined and on message, and they think that this big emphasis that the Trump campaign has put on transgender rights is something that's going to backfire because it seems like a distraction. Donald Trump's difficulty staying on message. It's also something that you don't have to be a political pro to understand.
Stick to what he did, what the economy is, the border wall.
Just talking to some of his supporters outside of a rally in Southwest Pennsylvania, one of them told me as much.
I don't disagree with his name calling. I do enjoy the entertainment, but stick to the policy for the voters out there that are still undecided.
If Donald Trump can stick to the economy, he's got a big advantage in Pennsylvania. People have warm memories of his presidency. They don't necessarily blame him for COVID. But with distractions and offensive statements, they might think, oh, yeah, I remember that part of the presidency, too.
But that question of Mr. Trump staying on message is a big if, right? What's your take on who's ultimately going to win this? What are the factors there?
One factor is who has the better ground game. The Harris campaign is very organized. They've set up offices in rural areas to try to cut down on Donald Trump's vote there. They're trying to turn out their more reliable cities. They're knocking on doors in the suburbs, getting people fired up. The Trump campaign has a smaller operation, but it's working with a constellation of groups to turn people out. That may end up working, or it could end up being catastrophic and making the difference for, tens of thousands of people who otherwise would have showed up if there was a better ground game. In a state this close, just the simple mechanics of calling people, texting them, reminding them to vote, going to their house, following up with people who've registered but haven't voted yet, all of that boring campaign work could make the difference.
So, Adam, this is the last of our swing state series. These campaigns are ultimately wrapping up. Both candidates had these big closing rallies. Donald Trump in Madison Square Garden, Kamala Harris at the Ellipse in Washington, D.C. What do you reckon to what they've had to say this week as the end game of the ground game begins?
As of right now, this is certainly the closest presidential contest that I think anyone has seen in a very long time. In the final days of this campaign, Kamala Harris is sticking to her messaging, talking about growing up in a middle-class family, that sort of thing. But she also has a much darker version of Donald Trump. She's saying, I agree that he is a fascist, sort of elevating the rhetoric.
You've quoted General Milley calling Donald Trump a fascist. You yourself have not used that word to describe him. Let me ask you tonight, do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
And she held this closing argument speech at the Ellipse, which, of course, was the infamous site of Donald Trump's January 6th speech. And obviously, that's not an accident.
We know who Donald Trump is. He is the person who stood at this very spot nearly 4 years ago and sent an armed mob to the United States Capitol to overturn the will of the people in a free and fair election.
And then you have Donald Trump. In the closing days of the campaign, he knows it's close and he's trying to avoid distractions. You probably heard about the very offensive statements that the comedian made at his event. But Donald Trump also gave a speech at Madison Square Garden that was overshadowed. And on the Trump curve, he was relatively disciplined during that speech.
And I'd like to begin by asking a very simple question. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?
One of Donald Trump's favorite things to do as a campaigner is to flip arguments back against his opponents. So he's now saying that the Harris campaign is a campaign of hate and that he's offering a positive vision for the country.
Kamala Harris is a train wreck. I mean, this is a train wreck who has destroyed everything in her path. To make her president would be to gamble with the lives of millions of people. She would get us into World War III because she is too grossly incompetent to do the job. And then all of your
They both have this sort of apocalyptic vision of each other. And very soon we're going to find out how voters in these swing states responded to these messages. And it's very possible that tens of thousands of people across these swing states are going to end up deciding the outcome of this election.
Thanks very much for your time, Adam.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, The Economist doesn't have a vote, but we have a long-running tradition of saying who we would vote for in America's election if we could. Like a swing state, we've gone back and forth down the years between Republican and Democratic contenders. Tune in to Friday's episode of Checks and Balance, our subscriber-only sister show on American politics, to hear our editor-in-chief, Zanny Minton-Beddoes, talk about who we're backing this time, and more importantly, why.
Day, we're going to have a little shopping drive, a little two-step, a little boogie-woogie with our DJ Storm.
A few weeks ago, I went to a conference hosted by TikTok that was for influencers.
Avantika Chilcotti is our global business correspondent.
So you had panels with a few influencers sharing tips on how to create the best posts. There was this duo, Shits and Gigs. They have one of the most famous podcasts out there, who are sharing their experience becoming, I'd say, some of the UK's top influencers.
Yeah, we run it full screen. Yeah, full screen. So we had black space here, black space there, and yeah, if you scroll all the way down, you can see the content was shocking. Yeah,
it's still up.
It's still up there. Yeah. Because we're authentic, we'll keep it. We're authentic. But I think maybe like a year later, we started doing like split screen.
What really struck me was the fact that I was expecting there to be just a room full of young people who did 2 or 3 things, maybe fashion or beauty. And I ended up meeting one woman who specializes in sharing videos of football skills. And I also met someone else who was actually a PhD student, a physicist. And all of her content is totally focused on promoting women in STEM. So the whole thing was a real eye-opener. And what I realized was that this is just a huge industry today. It's a huge part of how anyone markets anything.
So just how big is this influencer economy?
So it's really important to start by defining what an influencer is. Some of them like to be called creators. To be honest, it's a really grey area. They do much the same thing. These people are anything from comedians to fashionistas to train spotters, and they are on social media platforms. They all do the same thing. They are gaining lots and lots of followers online and monetizing that. What's really striking is just how big this economy has become. So it's not easy to put a number on it, but Goldman Sachs reckons that by 2027, it will be a $480 billion economy. Bear in mind that was a $250 billion economy in 2022, you can see that it's really growing. Basically, if you go back 20 years, that was when influencers first came about. When we got an iPhone, suddenly everyone had access to a high-quality camera. You had these social media platforms like Instagram, Facebook, TikTok emerging over the years, and they made it cheaper and easier than ever to share content. Anyone could suddenly do it. Again, Goldman Sachs thinks that now there's 50 million people around the world who think that they are influencers. That's 4 times the number of doctors and 10 times the number of dentists. So this is actually a huge profession.
Okay, so that's the influencers. What about those of us who are being influenced? Who's actually watching these videos?
So something really interesting in the reporting was that there's this common misconception that it's young people who are influenced. It's young people on social media. And that's just absolutely not true anymore. So 60% of Gen X American consumers and 30% of those who are boomers or older now shop through influencers. They are being influenced when they make their shopping choices. And if you break this down, what I think is really interesting is, yes, sure, Gen Z, millennials, they shop at higher rates through influencers, but they make cheaper purchases. These older consumers are influenced and they're making big ticket purchases based on what they see on social media. You can also see on the brand side. So if you see a brand like Louis Vuitton or a brand like Walmart, they are now all using influencer marketing.
So, Avantika, am I in the wrong job? Should I be giving up my old-fashioned job in traditional media and trying to get onto TikTok?
I would follow you, but actually you're probably a bit too late to the game at this point. So My analysis is that there's just too many people who want to be influencers right now. So 50 million is a huge number. Goldman Sachs thinks that that number is going up by 10 to 20% every single year. The majority of Gen Z, if you ask them, say they would like to be an influencer if they were given the opportunity. So there's just a lot of people who want to be influencers, and that creates a huge amount of competition. So at the moment, only 4% of influencers make over $100,000 a year. A lot of them make absolutely nothing doing this. There's only so many brand deals to go around. There's only so many posts that can go viral at once. And a lot of people are going into this thinking that it's an easy, quick way to get famous and make lots of money. It's just absolutely not true.
So I'm glad you tell me that I'm late to the game because of there being too many, not that I'm too old. So you're saying there's a huge oversupply of influencers. What does that mean for the brands relying on them?
All of these brands have a really tough time trying to find the influencers that they want to work with. So on one end, they all work with one or two big mega star influencers. You know, those people who have over 1 million followers. And at the same time, what we're seeing now, because they're spoilt for choice, they can choose amongst these influencers. They're spending a lot more money through sort of niche influencers. So say the woman in New York over 60 who's interested in sustainable fashion. You can really target a specific demographic if you find a niche influencer. So again, the figures are really striking. Almost 50% of influencer marketing spend goes to influencers with fewer than 20,000 followers. Just a few years ago, that was about 20%. So more and more money is going through these niche influencers. It's almost better to have a small, engaged audience who trust you, who will spend money according to your recommendation, than just to be a generic social media celebrity now.
So can the influencer boom last?
It can last. The question is that will consumers stay engaged with influencers? What we're already starting to see is that people are saying that they're sick of being sold stuff on social media. These people got famous because consumers trusted them. They thought that they were posting authentic, real takes on their life, the trends that they liked, the brands and products that they liked. But increasingly, as you're being fed more and more sponsored content on social media, consumers are starting to get sick of it. We don't want to be peddled stuff by people we thought were our friends, essentially.
I won't have my notice in yet then. Thanks, Avantika. Great to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
Subscribing to Economist Podcast Plus helps make our journalism possible. Thank you. Search Economist Podcast Plus for a free trial.
Veteran goth figureheads The Cure have released a new album today, Songs of a Lost World, which is their first in 16 years.
David Bennin writes about music for The Economist.
Arriving the day after Halloween, which is goth Christmas, it manages to be very clearly The Cure and also to forge an individual sound of its own that you can hear on tracks like the opening cut alone. The Hanging Garden by The Cure is an emblematically goth song, but goth is more a sensibility than one particular style or sound. But they're all united by a doomy romanticism and a fascination with the macabre. And in over 40 years of subterranean existence, since the idea of goth was codified at the Batcave, which was a short-lived weekly goth night in London's Soho, it has experienced periodic eruptions overground. Marilyn Manson's Rock is Dead features on the soundtrack of the first Matrix movie. Around the same time, you had the so-called mall goth culture, which was driven by the Hot Topic store chain. But it's probably never been more mainstream than it is today when you see goth aesthetic being co-opted by such major fashion houses as Versace and Burberry. Billie Eilish, whose track You Should See Me in a Crown, is definitely on the gloomy side, but it's not what you would usually consider overtly goth. But she, nonetheless, is a goth figurehead today. that illustrates the key to goth's resilience, which is its continuing appeal to the young. And it's notable that Billie Eilish was initially associated with goth's junior offshoot, emo. Emo is something you might associate with bands like My Chemical Romance and a track such as I'm Not Okay. One explanation of the difference is emos hate themselves while goths hate everyone, which is droll but I would say unjust. Emo claims its own cultural space, but it has proved a kind of training ground for those who go on to be full-blown goths. If you want to see goths' pan-generational appeal for yourself, one of the best places to do it is at the long-running club night in London called Slimelight, where you might meet attendees who were getting on a bit when it first opened in 1987, and others who have only just reached an age where they can be let in at all. I've spent many a happy if gloomy night there, seeing among other acts a tribute to Susie and the Banshees, playing classics such as Happy House. Another key to goth's endurance is the way it has of infiltrating other genres. You can hear goth electronic musics, such as a cover of Atmosphere, the Joy Division song by Teknova, which nicely illustrates the link between post-punk and electronic. You can hear it in industrial music, which is a very goth-adjacent genre, with a band like Nine Inch Nails and Closer. You let me violate you. You let me desecrate you. It's been taken up into rap. You might have a band like Gravediggers, which was a band that featured RZA out of the Wu-Tang Clan, and who did very dark, funny songs like 1-800-Suicide. Of course, it's long been closely associated with synth pop, especially an act like Gary Newman and songs like Our Friends Electric. It also extends its tendrils into darkwave and ambient and folk, all of which you can hear in Dead Can Dance, for example, and their song The Mountain. It keeps evolving. There's now a genre known as future pop, which is a kind of darkwave light that you can hear on VNV Nation's Illusion. Might simply be quicker to list the popular music forms that don't have a goth contingent. That's the advantage of a subculture obsessed with all things undead. That which does not live can never die.
That's all for this episode of The Intelligence. The show's editors are Chris Impey and Jad Gill. Our deputy editor is John Joe Devlin, and our sound designer is Will Rowe. Our senior producers are Rory Galloway and Sarah Lorniuk, and our senior creative producer is William Warren. Our producers are Maggie Kadifa and Benji Guy, and our assistant producer is Henrietta McFarlane, with extra production help this week from Jonathan Day and Kunal Patel. We'll all see you back here tomorrow for the Weekend Intelligence.